Welcome to the Distinguished Physical Education Podcast. This is Gary Zaharatos. Before beginning today's episode, I just wanted to thank everyone who has picked up a copy of my book on Amazon titled Becoming a Distinguished Physical Education Teacher. The reviews, feedback, and messages that I've been receiving from people are quite inspiring, and I'm glad that people are finding it useful. We also have a growing number of PE experts joining our Facebook group, and we welcome all teachers who enjoy growing and reflecting on best practice in physical education. If you're interested in joining our group on Facebook, simply search for Distinguished Physical Education. My guest today is Sara Whatmore. Sara earned a BA in Child Development from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She taught kindergarten and first grade for 11 years, 2 of those in Charlotte, North Carolina, and 9 in Aurora, Colorado. Sara then transitioned out of the classroom and into the gym while earning a master's in physical education from the University of Northern Colorado. She currently teaches PE at Stephen Knight Center for Early Education in Denver Public Schools, where she is able to combine her experience of working with children ages 3 to 6 and her passion for physical education all in one role. Sara is also a physical education regional team specialist, which allows her to create and facilitate professional development around PE in primary grades for other teachers in Denver. I have attended several of Sara's PD sessions and always walk away having learned something new about teaching ECE physical education. She is an asset to the elementary teachers of Denver, and it's a pleasure to have her on the podcast. During our conversation, we talk about how to create a safe and welcome environment for students who may be experiencing PE for the first time, strategies for managing young students' attention spans, the impact of providing students with choices, how to encourage cooperation among pre-K students, ECE standards and assessment, how to effectively collaborate with para-educators, advice for new teachers, and other topics. And now I bring you Sara Whatmore. Sara, thank you for sitting down to talk ECE physical education with me today. I'd like to start with what inspired you to become a preschool PE teacher?
Well, first of all, I was a very successful neighborhood babysitter. Then as a young college student, I decided to enroll in the child development or ECE, which is early childhood education program at UNC. After realizing how important those early years are for children to learn foundational skills that set them up for success. So fast forward several years from there, and I was teaching first grade in Aurora, Colorado, and found myself peeking into the gym and watching our amazing and inspiring PE teacher, Chris Strader, who I actually just chatted with for a minute. And well, she's retired, but she's still very active in the PE world here. But I was wishing that I was doing that instead. I had always been an endurance athlete, and I was coaching girls on the run. And I realized that I really wanted to share my love for physical activity and how it benefits all areas of your life. And while working with Chris in a before school exercise program in her gym, I confessed that I wanted to get my master's in PE, and she just kind of gave me that extra confidence boost that I needed to pursue that.
That's awesome. She must be pretty proud that she was able to influence you in that way.
Yeah, she was great.
Well, I think that it's a story that a lot of PE teachers can relate to, because there's a good bit of PE teachers that I work with who came from the classroom, and they always bring the structures and instructional methods from the classroom into the gym, and they usually end up having a pretty seamless transition. Let's start with defining a couple terms. So in DPS, we use the term ECE, early childhood education, but there are some other terms that I think people might be familiar with that mean kind of the same thing. What are some other terms that people use when they talk about early childhood education?
Sure. You would hear pre-K a lot, which is, I guess, just pre-kindergarten. I think just the term preschool is probably more universal and kind of encompasses what we're going to talk about today. So yeah, for the purpose of this conversation, I'll probably say preschool a lot, or ECE. And that refers to children ages 3 through 6, at least here in DPS especially.
It's great to be able to talk to someone who has such high level of expertise with younger students, because a lot of the times that I'll be coaching or working with a teacher, they always say, please come during my 3rd grade class, or please come during my 5th grade class, but just stay away from the ECE classes. So they can be a little hesitant, just because I think we have to treat those students a little bit differently than some of the older kids. There's some different techniques and different methods that we might want to use. I think first thing on most teachers' minds when 3 and 4-year-old students show up at the gym door is teachers wondering how they're going to manage them. So let's start by talking about the structure of your learning environment and how do you ensure a safe and welcoming space for your students?
So just when you mentioned that some PE teachers are concerned with how to like manage kids this age, the first thing I think about is during my student teaching, I had an amazing mentor teacher, and we were in a 4-year-old classroom, just preschool classroom. And right before I was about to begin my like full-time lead teaching as a student teacher, she pulls me over. The bell's about to ring. And she goes, just remember, you're bigger than them and you're smarter than them. And she was totally kidding. And so I started laughing. And then she goes, I know there's more of them, but they can't get organized to take over. So you're going to be okay.
That's great. That's great.
Plus, I say that a lot to new teachers or substitute teachers who haven't worked with ECE much, or any a parent volunteer. But I will just be like, you're bigger than them and you're smarter. Kind of take the edge off because it's not that bad.
That's a good reminder. Gets people in the right mindset. So let's talk about once you remind yourself that you're bigger than these students. What is it specifically that you do to make sure that the environment is safe and welcoming for your students?
Sure. So one motto or I guess phrase that I say a lot, and I also have it posted in the gym, is safe and fun for everyone. And it kind of rhymes, and I think it catches on with the little ones. And that just means that everybody deserves to have fun and everybody deserves to feel safe. And at the same time, it's not okay to make it unsafe or unpleasant for anyone else. So that's kind of just like sets the tone for the learning environment there. And then I guess just generally some of the messages that I try to share with my classes are that PE is meant to be fun. And that it's fun to try hard things, and it's okay to take risks and try new things and make mistakes. And that's just kind of part of being in PE and being in the gym. I share that exercise is good for your body and your brain, especially cardiovascular exercise can make you feel better when you're feeling worried or sad or just too excited or any uncomfortable feeling. And I try to share that with my kiddos a lot. And the physical activity is just a lifelong thing. And I share my activities that I do with my students, and I ask about their families' activities and things that they do outside of school regularly.
There's so many great things in there. So you are already, with such young students, establishing a culture around lifelong physical activity, that physical activity is good for their bodies and for their minds. Mm-hmm. And that physical activity should be fun and inclusive for everybody. Let's move on to a question that some folks on Facebook had wanted me to ask you, which is managing the attention span and energy levels of 3 to 6-year-old students during physical activities. Do you have any tips or strategies for how you manage students' attention spans?
Sure, that's a legitimate concern. So I try to keep activities relatively short and incorporate choices whenever possible. Like a warm up is maybe 5 minutes or less. Then we meet in I just call it our welcome circle. And I maybe talk for like 5 minutes at the most. And this is when I would explain like what the rest of the class looks like. A structured game or activity is maybe 10 to 15 minutes. After that, we have 10 minutes of choice time, which I can go into more later. And then a cool down is about 5 minutes. And I see my students for 40 minutes, sometimes 45 minutes, depending on the schedule for the year. And that kind of takes up the whole time. But I think you just got to kind of keep the pace moving.
What would you advocate for? Like, let's say that there was a PE teacher who has ECE or pre-K on their schedule, and they have a voice in how long classes should be. What do you think is the ideal length of a PE class for pre-K students?
Wow, that's a tough question because we're so many more moving parts to a school schedule that you just kind of don't have control.
Yeah.
So I feel like 30 minutes would be maybe like ideal, but in reality, that's not when you think about like a 3-year-olds, but in reality, that's probably not what you're going to get. That's where I think this having the choice time built into your schedule can help fill some of that time because you are giving them very like purposely chosen activities, but they have choice. And then you can kind of extend that time or cut it short just to kind of manage the time that you have with those kiddos.
Yeah, I ask because there's a handful of elementary teachers that I support who will do a swap like with one of the other specials with music or art. So even though it's a 45-minute class, they split that time up between the art and the music teacher. I know that 20 minutes or so seems a little bit short, but
Yeah.
there's a lot of folks out there, and I myself included, who think that 45 minutes with our youngest students can be quite a challenge.
Being a teammate, like an art or music teacher that's on board with that sounds interesting. But I know like managing gym equipment is different than managing paint and musical instruments.
Continue on with a little bit more of the structure of your class. So you mentioned that after you maybe share the activities or maybe your objective for the day, that students will go into 10 or 15 minutes of activity before choice time. What does a structured choice time look like?
I think that having the choice time in the ECE world is really important. It very much connects with just developmentally appropriate practice in preschool in general. So after our more like structured activity is over, my students get maybe 10 minutes or so of what we call choice time. And this is where I have the gym divided up into 2, maybe 3 different areas where they can choose a piece of equipment and use it in a focused way. So I might have hula hoops on 1/3 of the gym and scooter boards on another part of the gym, and then maybe a speaker and some ribbons on another part of the gym. And this is where they can choose their activity and they're expected to kind of stay busy with that activity during that amount of time. And they are allowed to move to a different choice during that time. And I mean, before I even send them off to choice time, we've already talked about the expectations for how to use the equipment and different ways to use the equipment in a safe way in that space. But, that kind of brings in that play that's so important for the preschoolers.
Yeah, and I hear you mention too that you go over what the expectations are, that it's structured and focused, right? So when we talk about free time or structured free time, it's not just random equipment out there and students not really having any type of focus or goal when they're playing, right?
No, we build up to that throughout the year. Like at the very beginning of the year, the choices might be, well, sometimes if the first week of school, everybody just gets a hula hoop, and we'll talk about the different ways you can use the hoop in a safe way to practice, different skills. Maybe you're jumping through it like a jump rope. Maybe you're hula hooping. Maybe you are holding it around your waist and driving a car around the gym. After you explain all the things that they can do with the piece of equipment, then they'll need reminders about what they should not be doing with the piece of equipment. But I try to focus on the positive.
Yeah, I just really wanted to highlight the difference between what you're describing as like a structured free time as opposed to just everybody like a free-for-all type choice time at the end of class.
Yeah, absolutely. And we spend time modeling. This is what it looks like when you're using the equipment in a safe way when you're in the gym at school.
So speaking of equipment, what are some adaptations or modifications that you make to your equipment or even to your facilities, like to your gym itself, to suit the needs of younger students in physical education?
So typical modifications might just be having different choices of targets for throwing activities, different heights of basketball hoops. I even have purchased some of those very small portable hoops for some of my youngest kiddos that are just being exposed to this activity. There's always different choices for balls, different size hula hoops, stuff like that. That's probably not too different from other grade levels.
It seems like just best practice in
Sure.
differentiating and modifying equipment so that students can feel some level of success while also being challenged at the same time.
And I mean, lots of times they just have fun experimenting with the different targets and balls and sizes of things, even though if it's not necessarily modification, it's just a way to kind of keep things fresh.
Yeah. Thinking on that topic, I've seen quite a few teachers use exploratory time with equipment. Is that a strategy that you use with your students in the gym?
Sure, I do encourage them to be creative with some of the equipment as long as it's, reasonably safe. I think that's important at the beginning of the year, especially because they're going to do it anyways because they're 3 and 4 and they haven't seen a scooter board before. So I think that's fair.
Yeah, I certainly think that there's some advantages to it. There was a teacher that I worked with, it's probably about 8 or 10 years ago now, who was starting a mini unit on scarps, manipulatives, and the kids were so excited. It was an early elementary class, maybe kindergarten or first grade, and the kids were so excited at all of the different colors of scarves. And I thought that the way that he introduced that lesson was brilliant because he told them what the safety rules were. So it was something like, you have to keep the scarf to yourself. You can't touch someone else's scarf. You have to stay within the boundaries and you have to make sure you don't bump into each other. So just very simple safety
Yeah.
rules. And then he gave students, 3, 4, 5 minutes to go explore with the scarf any way that they like, right? And kids were being super creative and they had an opportunity to use this piece of equipment that they were very excited about. And maybe they wouldn't have been able to follow directions as well if they didn't get the exploratory part out of their system. The other part that he did, which was really cool, was if he saw a student do a trick with their scarf, like throw the scarf up in the air, spin around in a circle and let the scarf land on your head. He presented that challenge to the whole class after the exploratory time as if that student had created it and that the whole class got a chance to try it. So he would say something like, I noticed during our exploratory time that Sarah did XYZ. And then he would share that with the class and everybody would get to go do it. And they were so excited to try something that Sarah had just invented.
No, I think that's great. I have kids stick scarves down the collar of their shirt and they fly like superheroes. And I've never seen them run so hard. Like it's a great way to get them moving. If you say, hey, go run a lap, that's not the same as go be a superhero. But
You just have to be a little bit more creative with the younger kids. Let's talk a little bit about how you encourage social interaction and cooperation among younger students in physical activities. Do you have any advice for people who are looking to make sure that their younger students are cooperating with each other?
Sure. So setting expectations and modeling how to talk and behave with a partner or a group is definitely step number 1. Especially at the beginning of the year, we talk about how to ask for turns, how to use encouraging words, how to handle feelings of frustration and stuff like that. We talk about what good sportsmanship looks like and what it sounds like. I'll often say, it might sound silly, but like turn to your partner and tell them nice job. And they'll go, nice job. Or turn to your partner and give them a high five. Turn to your teammates and give them a thumbs up. Or turn to your partner and tell them, thanks for being my partner. And I think they think it's silly, but then they'll just kind of start doing it on their own without the prompts.
That's great.
I think one thing I'm working on myself also is to not intervene when students are working through a problem or testing out new equipment in a new way. I think sometimes that's hard to just kind of step back and kind of let them work things out. But yeah, I try to give the children an opportunity to problem solve themselves before stepping in to ask for help. Sometimes I'll observe students making up a game together or using equipment in maybe a questionable way. And I'll have to say to myself or the pair that's with me, let's just see where this goes. And lots of times they come up with really great ideas and games before I would maybe step in.
There's so many things that you're saying that lend itself to the culture that you build in your space, allowing students to be so creative and to have a voice in the activities that they participate in. I just think that's such a great culture and such a great introduction to physical activity.
Thanks. I mean, that's something that I think maybe we could all work on, but just as teachers, you want to step in and help them and show them things and model it. And, there's a place for that, but sometimes you just kind of let them figure it out.
What is the line that you would draw there? Is it, I'm assuming that safety would be the main one, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Or if it just becomes just time, if it's time to move on. But yeah, safety is definitely number one.
So if it's unsafe, or if you find that it's detracting from the activity time, yeah.
They don't realize time's passing, and I'm like, you guys have 5 minutes left. Let's move on.
So speaking of possible detractions from activity or from instructional time, I'd like to ask you how you handle behavioral challenges or disruptions during physical activities. So one way to think about that is how you handle individual or very small groups of students, if 1 or 2 or 3 students is disrupting the learning environment, versus larger groups like half the class. How do you handle disruptive behavior, whether it's more individual or a larger group?
So when it's just a few students that are off task, the first thing that I'll do is try to firmly review their choices. So I might say, your choices are hula hoops or scooter boards. And then from there, I might have to be a little more specific. For a hula hoop, I would remind them, you can roll the hoop, you can spin it, you can jump through it. Throwing it in the air is not one of those choices, and trying to be very consistent with that. If that doesn't help, I explain that taking a break is also a choice. I think using the word choice is really important, especially for young kiddos, because it gives them a feeling of control and that they have the power to make a choice. And I always lead with what they can do before I add in what is not allowed, especially when it comes to safety.
That's great advice. I think a lot of people lead with what not to do first, right?
Yeah.
Do you notice a difference when you made that shift over to leading with what the acceptable responses are as opposed to what not to do first?
Oh, sure. And I think a lot of times kiddos this age might not realize that what they're doing is dangerous or off task until maybe you remind them, these were the choices that you had. What you're doing is not within those choices. And then oh yeah. And yeah. And then sometimes you just have to hop in and play with them for a few minutes to get them back on track.
All right. So it seems like if it's more of an individual issue, you can restate the expectations. You can remind students of what the acceptable activities are before telling them what they're not supposed to be doing.
Sure.
What happens if we're talking about a larger percentage of the class?
That's where I might just have the class freeze. I use hands on top, and I put my hands on my head, and the kiddos respond with, that means stop. And then the whole class freezes, and I might review things as a whole group. Or if I need to, I bring us back into the circle to review things. But then sometimes I have to wonder if it's just something that maybe we just move on from that activity, and I need to think about what I need to change for the following day.
That's a really good point. I think sometimes teachers will fight to really make an activity that they had spent so much time planning for work, regardless of the environment, right? What I like too about what you said was, it seems like you have different levels of resets. Like the first thing that you do when you notice half the class is, displaying off-task behavior, you don't just immediately run out into the hallway with everybody. It seems like you have a general space reset where you pause everybody and restate your expectations before moving on. And then if you need it, you still have other strategies that you can use, like bringing students back to the middle circle or back to their home base spots.
Sure. And, something that worked from the class that you just had might not go the same for the class that's in front of you right then. And that's where you just kind of reflect and figure out what to do next time.
Sometimes you just have to use what the students are giving you, right? And know when to dig in or know when to move on.
Yeah.
Now that we've talked about what it takes to set up a culture in your gym with younger students, to have a safe and welcome learning environment, let's move over to the instructional side of things and talk a little bit about standards. Can you share with us what standards you use to plan your pre-K lessons?
So sure. In my position at DPS, there's a few resources that I use. Mostly I go to the Colorado Department of Education PE standards. And then I also use the TS Gold objectives. TS stands for Teaching Strategies. And that's the curriculum that the Early Childhood Education Department uses. TS Gold is a formative assessment tool that's based on observation. And it's also part of our classroom teacher's curriculum. And as the PE teacher, I report assessment data for all the gross motor objectives, which are locomotor skills, balancing, and manipulative skills like throwing, catching, kicking, bouncing, stuff like that. I really like that tool because it lays everything out on a continuum. And I could get into that more if you.
I knew that there was going to be so much that I was going to learn from you today, and this is certainly one of them. So I didn't know that there was a physical skills component in TS Gold.
Yeah, there's 3. I think it's under their gross motor part of their curriculum, but there's 3 objectives that are for those skills, and those are the skills that I'm responsible for assessing and reporting. Something about that, though, I guess kind of on the side, is that they are very much like performance-based objectives, and it's what you observe the kiddos doing. And this is where I will switch to the Colorado Department of Education standards, because it gets more into that social emotional objectives, safety, and like lifelong physical activity understandings that I won't see with TS Gold.
I'm right there with you. I do a lot of advocating with the teachers that I work for to move away slightly from our locomotor standards. I'm thinking in Colorado, Standard 1 and Standard 2 is the one that talks about various fitness components, and to move into the social, emotional, and safety standards. We have such rich language, especially in the Colorado standards, and I know that the new national standards are written so well also, that when it comes to those social and emotional grade level outcomes, there's such an opportunity there for PE teachers to step in and really make an impact, not just in the gym, but in students' classes and in real world situations as well. Do you find yourself teaching to those social skills standards quite often? Like what percentage of the year would you say?
Oh my gosh, that's a good question. I mean, I feel like more than half is, and maybe just because I'm working with young kiddos, and I just think building those social emotional skills like teamwork and cooperation and risk taking and goal setting and all of those things are almost more important sometimes, or else just to be successful in physical activity and sports in the future.
And outside of physical activity and sports also, whether kids are at recess or if they're playing at the park or they're trying to collaborate in the classroom, I think it's just such a great opportunity that PE teachers have, where we might be the only content area that has a social skills based standard.
You're right. And this was also one of the, like a big reason that I went from the classroom to PE. One more thing about assessment is that, like, I don't know if it's just for the younger kiddos that I work with, but like they cannot wait to show you their skills. And I think sometimes just calling the kiddo over and saying like, hey, Gary, come show me how you can skip. And they're like right away, and they can't wait to show you. And like, that's a fine way to catch an observation and assess a kid. Because then 5 other kids also want to come over and show you what they can do. And while they're busy showing off their skills, you might as well pull out your clipboard and check it off.
That sounds like a great way to get students excited to demonstrate their learning. Continuing on with instruction and standards-based learning for younger students, what instructional methods do you find to be most effective for teaching fundamental movement skills or even social emotional skills like we just mentioned?
I think like one of the biggest, maybe even tips I could share with a new teacher or someone getting into ECE is like, I almost never have an activity where students have to wait for a turn to use equipment or to demonstrate a skill. Waiting is just too hard for the young ones. So if they're waiting for a turn to use a piece of equipment, for example, like waiting to walk across the balance beam or waiting to shoot at the tall basketball hoop, they're doing that because that's their choice. because there's almost always an alternative activity that they can go to that doesn't require waiting. So I try to kind of set up my stations in choice time activities so that if they don't want to wait for something, they can always go and do something else.
When we have students waiting in line for an
Mhm.
activity, what are some things that happen during class?
I think that's where you start seeing some challenging behaviors. Just waiting is hard for little ones, and they want the person in front of them to go faster. Just patience is tough for the little ones.
Yeah, I think waiting and patience are tough for
Mhm.
adults as well. There's been a handful of teachers that I've supported over the years who, when I asked them to reflect on why some students were exhibiting disruptive behavior, they struggle to make the connection between students having idle time, students having to
Mhm.
wait in a line of 6 or 7 peers before
Yeah,
they get a chance to participate in the activity. You can't really blame students when they're put in a situation like that. They're at the back of a long line.
right.
They're going to find something to do with their time. And more often than not, it's going to be something that disrupts the learning of others.
Yeah, and sometimes I'll say like this equipment will be out for the next 10 minutes. Why don't you go to the other station or make another choice and come back, and maybe nobody will be here when you come back. And that happens a lot.
Well, that's great. That's great too, to just remind students that there might be another opportunity to participate in it later. And you could even, I'm sure that you use some of the same stations or activities in other classes too. So if kids don't get a chance that day,
Right.
they can always go back to it in a different class.
Yeah, totally.
What about some of the ways that you deliver instruction? You mentioned earlier when you talked about the structure of your lessons that you keep your instructional time pretty short. How do you describe things like skill cues and still keep it somewhat concise so that you don't lose their attention?
Sure. So if we're practicing a skill in whole group, for example, maybe overhand throwing, I'll keep it very brief, and I'll have everybody have a piece of equipment. Or sometimes I call it invisible equipment. So I'll have them all pick up the ball and we're all going to practice overhand throwing just a handful of times just to kind of keep the pace moving. And then I can move into other instruction like individually later on during an activity with those kids. And as far as cueing goes, I try to keep cues for skills very short. For example, if they're practicing skipping, I might say step, hop, or left hop, right hop, instead of going into more detailed things that might not be appropriate for preschoolers. For example, if they're catching a large ball, I might just say ready feet, hands out, bring it in. Just 3 short things that the little ones can kind of hang on to.
I'm curious now that we're talking about language. Do you ever give students the opportunity to repeat some of those cues back to you or to a partner? And what role does students using the language of the skill cues play in their development of those skills?
Yeah, that's something that kind of builds during the year. I feel like around springtime is when I can start having them do that a little bit more. And yeah, I think it's very like empowering for the little ones to play teacher or give tips to their peers in a respectful way.
One of the things that makes Denver Public Schools such a unique place is that we have a lot of English language learners and that we expect teachers, regardless of what content they teach, to give students opportunities throughout the lesson to describe what they're learning or explain what they're learning or justify their thinking. So I was just curious at what that could potentially look like for students at such a young age and what impact it might have on their development as well.
As far as multi-language learners goes, is that your English language learners?
Yeah, it could be for our multi-language learners. It could
Okay.
just for everybody because the expectation
Mhm.
from our growth and performance system is that all students have opportunities to use language along with the other skills that they're demonstrating. So I was just curious at what that looks like with 3 or 4-year-olds.
Well, let's see. I do a lot of that during I call it like cool down time, but kind of the wrap up when we kind of regroup and talk about how the day went and what we're going to do the following day. And that's where I might have them model what they did to a partner. I guess that's like probably the number one way that I do that. But as far as like English language learners goes, I think that's where keeping steps and cues and things just short and sweet is really important. And then there's the visual side of that where I would have just videos, images, or like, short video of, what do you call it? Like a GIF or something of skipping or something up on the wall just to give that visual piece.
I think that's a great strategy. Many of the teachers that I support will have those GIFs just rolling, right, projected up on the wall. And you can see students refer to them throughout the lesson. So they're picking up on that visual cue on something that they may not have picked up the first time when the teacher described it or modeled it.
Yeah. And I think having like an image or picture video available, like frees the teacher up to chat with those students that need that help rather than the teacher being the one that's galloping or throwing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it frees the teacher up to, circulate throughout the classroom,
Right.
check for students' understanding on other things, provide some feedback, etc.
Like it's more work at the beginning to get those things prepared, but then it less work in the end.
Yeah, I think it's worth it too. With the new school year coming up, I think a lot of teachers spend some time thinking about how they want to plan differently for their pre-K classes. Can you give folks just an outline of like what the first week or first couple of days of school looks like? What are some things that you focus on and how do you plan for your students for that first week?
The young kiddos are just so excited to even be in school. So there's that. But at the beginning of the year, I think that it's okay to start very slow, introduce equipment slowly, maybe like one piece at a time, talk about what they can do with it instead of what's not allowed, and begin with focusing on like one or two rules or expectations at a time, and then go from there. And just remembering that their attention spans are short and they are just way too excited to play. And it might be their first time in a gym like yours. And talking about rules for more than just a few minutes is not going to be effective. So yeah, just start each activity with a few basics, and then you can just regroup and review expectations as needed early on.
So being very slow and very intentional about how you communicate your expectations. I'm sure that physical practice of those expectations is a part of it also.
Sure, it's like lots of modeling. I'll model something. I'll invite 2 or 3 kids to then model it before I send them off to do something.
So it's not just like a communicated expectation and then the whole class goes and does it. It's very slow and focused and intentional, verbalizing what your expectations are and then having a couple students model it and then having the whole
Sure.
class go do it.
And like typically, I mean, in our district, I always have a paraeducator with me, and sometimes the two of us will role play something briefly before I send them off.
Yep.
And so, yeah, don't be scared to do that.
Well, that leads to another question that someone in our distinguished physical education Facebook group had for us, and that is how you collaborate with your teacher's assistants. Can you share a little bit about how you set expectations with your teaching partner so that you're covering all the bases and able to communicate expectations for students?
Sure. So it's important to get to know the paraeducator and how comfortable they are with different responsibilities in the gym. Some are very comfortable with coming in and just jumping right into the activity and, moving with the kids, which is great. And a lot of times we'll try to pair students or maybe like group a few students strategically and ask the para to support them specifically for various reasons. And I will often just run ideas past them or try to get their input or feedback on how an activity went and try to help them feel included and important to the PE class. And I think they really appreciate that. And yeah, I couldn't teach without them. They are very important. And just building a relationship with them and having fun with them.
Yeah, they are so invaluable to a teacher's
Yeah.
practice, especially with students at such an early age. What I hear you saying is there's a lot of intentional collaboration before students even arrive in the gym. So it's not just that the students show up and the teacher assistant is there or the paraeducator. and you're giving them a direction, 30 seconds before class starts.
No, and that just kind of builds throughout the year as you learn like what they're comfortable with and just like what their strengths are and how they can support you and the kids.
So finishing up with one or two more questions, what advice would you give to new PE teachers who are starting their first year teaching early elementary PE?
So my first thought was that like get out there and just play with the kids and get out there and hula hoop with them and shoot baskets and dance and just start building relationships with those kiddos. It's important to celebrate like all their little successes because they might be skipping for the first time and they feel so proud. So, just cheer with the kids. And then I think that like the longer that I do this with the little ones, the more I realize that like you shouldn't be scared to use big words and, different vocabulary words and define them. Like we talk about using dominant hands and hydration and heart rate and sportsmanship. And sometimes we even get into offense and defense. And there's lots of kids that are ready for those concepts and they really connect with them. And then, others who might not be quite there yet, they're still exposed to these concepts and it's not going to hurt them to hear some of these, bigger vocabulary words.
I think that's really important for teachers to hear because I bet that many of them are hesitant to use some of those content-specific words with the younger students. So it's good to hear that. I mean, you might be the one who is presenting this type of vocabulary to students for the first time, and that can be really exciting.
Yeah, and like I'll have, their parents will be like, my kiddo was telling me that they felt dehydrated, or I'm using some of these, and I think as long as they're using it appropriately.
That's really cool.
Yeah. And then I just think like, just be nice to yourself. EC can be challenging sometimes. And some days will test your patience, but it's totally okay to revisit an activity and reflect on it and make changes and just be honest with the class and say like, hey, I did some thinking and we're going to try it again a little bit different this time. And, if that's not possible due to scheduling or class rotations or other things, just like make some notes and tell yourself that you'll just do it different next time.
Yeah, I think that reflection is just so important, regardless of what level, just being able to reflect on things that went well during a class, things that you want to continue to do, or things that you might want to modify for your next group.
And even like just during the day, like what worked for one class and then it didn't work for the next class, and now you have two different ways to try.
I really do think that was one of the first lessons that I learned in my first year. I think that I spent too much time being too stubborn in that I spent so much time planning something and I was going to carry that plan out and that it was the student's fault if it didn't go according to plan, whereas it's almost always the exact opposite. I didn't plan something that was age appropriate for my students or that they found exciting, or maybe it was something that was too challenging. And I think being able to realize that you have to reflect on those things and not be afraid to make modifications is really important part of teaching.
Sure. And I think that just kind of comes with experience sometimes. Yeah.
Absolutely. So speaking about brand new teachers, what are some common mistakes that you would want teachers to try to avoid as they create their class culture in the beginning of the year?
So early in the year, I try to make it very clear that everyone doesn't get a turn to do everything every day. And I think I might even phrase it like that with the kids. That's kind of a hard lesson to learn, I think, for 3 and 4-year-olds. I try to remind them that we have a long year ahead together and that there will be many opportunities to like be it for the tag game or to be the first person in the relay race. I encourage them to just be happy for the students to get to be first or, get that turn and support them like a teammate because tomorrow it might be you. And just beginning the norm that like dwelling on who's going to be it or who's going to be first, like isn't worth missing out on the fun of the game and that your turn will come. I think that is a lot for kids this age, and starting that out first thing of the year can really help.
Yeah, I think establishing those norms and communicating in a transparent way, some of those components to students can be pretty beneficial.
And validating their feelings. Like, yeah, it's hard to wait. I know that you're sad, and that's okay. But I promise there will be days when you're it and you're first.
I think that relieves some anxiety from students, and it probably heads off some disruptive behavior that may have been about to happen.
Sure. And sometimes, like, after a while, if the kiddo is upset because they wanted to be first, one of their peers will even like remind them, like, hey, maybe tomorrow.
That's great. I mean, that goes right back to what you started talking about in the beginning around developing and building a culture in PE that's accepting and welcoming for all students. All right, Sarah, thank you so much for talking early childhood physical education today. I think we have some strategies and tips that are really going to help some of our teachers who focus on younger students.
Sure, that was fun. Thanks for having me.